Hey guys, Firebat here. I wanted to make a video today talking about the card nerfs from yesterday, just sort of figuring out what cards are playable and what cards are not playable, what's going to happen with the meta maybe. Like, it's all kind of speculation, right? Because we don't know all of the information yet, but we know a lot about the old gods, so some of it has to be at least a little accurate. So, anyway, without further ado, I'm going to just start up right into it. If you want to skip ahead to any specific card, just click it below, but here we go. First off, we have Knife Juggler change. So, Knife Juggler is, everybody knows, the really annoying 2-mana 3/2 that throws knives at things, kills all your 1 health minions, allows your opponent to win the game. Now, in Standard, we're going to see the change. Knife Juggler, still going to be a 2-mana minion, still going to throw knives, but it's only going to have 2 attack. So it's still an extremely strong card, that's the first point, but it does make it weaker to a few things. Makes it a little bit weaker to Stampede and Kodo. So if anything, this is kind of a buff to Stampede and Kodo rather than a nerf to Knife Juggler, and it's a little bit of a buff to Shadow Word Horror, which is a card that that a lot of people thought really wasn't going to see too much play. But maybe if all the big threats start having like 2 attack in the early game, maybe Shadow Word Horror, not such a bad card. I still think Shadow Word Horror kind of unplayable, but Knife Juggler definitely still going to see a lot of play. Still probably one of the best 2-drops in the game, so that's still going to be around. Next up, we have Leper Gnome. This was the super annoying 1-mana 2/1 that dealt 2 damage to the enemy hero when it died. Now it's a 1-mana 1/1 with the same death rattle effect. So, the thing about this card, like, yeah, it still does a lot of damage. You say, like, alright, Leper Gnome pre-nerf dealt about 4 damage, because you'd play it for 1 mana, it would hit your opponent for 2 damage, and then die, dealing 2 damage to the opponent's hero. But the biggest upside of Leper Gnome is its ability to trade with things. Aggro decks are still extremely board-centric in the early game. Even aggro shaman. They want to be protecting their tunnel trog, they want to be setting things up. So Leper Gnome only having 1 attack, sure, it makes aggro decks weaker in the fact that they have less damage coming at you, but it makes it way weaker in the fact that they have less trading potential on the board. So I think there may be just better 1-drops out there rather than Leper Gnome now, just because you still want to be controlling the board's turns 1, 2, and 3 as any aggro deck. Even aggro shaman, even face hunter still wants some amount of board control in the earlier stages of the game, which kind of makes this card not that great for doing that. So I think if there's a pure Smork deck, maybe like aggro rogue or a face shaman gets even more face, or face hunter gets even more face and stops caring about the board at all, it'll start seeing play. But other than that, I think Leper Gnome's going to slowly fade out and be not really seen too much. So I think this nerf dealt some damage to the card. Do I think it killed the card completely? No, I don't think it killed the card completely. I think you'll still see it around occasionally. They'll probably be in all face decks somewhere. It'll probably be in like face warrior and things like that. But I think it is a pretty good nerf, and it's definitely going to decrease the popularity of Leper Gnome as the aggressive card choice. Alright, next up we have Arcane Golem. So this card got changed dramatically. Originally, it was a 3-mana 4/2 charger that Battlecry give your opponent a mana crystal. Now it's a 3-mana 4/4 Battlecry give your opponent a mana crystal. So the way I see this card is it's got a huge downside when you play it, that it gives your opponent a mana crystal, which is insane in Hearthstone, and it does it immediately. It's not even a death rattle. And then at the same time, the upside of this card is that it's pretty much like on curve for stats. Like, it's not even, like, you don't even get that much benefit for the giving your opponent a mana crystal, because if you look at most of the 3-drops in the game, there's like 3 3s plus an effect is like the standard stat line for a 3-drop, or it's a 3/4. So you're gaining 1 extra attack value on your 3-drop at the cost of giving your opponent a mana crystal, and that's just a terrible exchange. This card is definitely significantly worse than even Dancing Swords, which is a card that doesn't see play. I don't think this card's going to see any play at all in any deck. I think this card was pretty much just removed from the game with the nerfs, which is maybe a little harsh to say, but come on, where is this going to be useful? Next up, we have the Molten Giant change. So Molten Giant, 20 mana card, and now it's going to be a 25 mana card, and it costs 1 less for each damage your hero has taken. So the biggest upside of this, obviously, is that you can now Holy Wrath for 25 damage. That's really good. Nah, I mean, that's a side note, but the important thing is here now, you need to be at 13 health to play it as an 8 mana 8/8. So if you put that into perspective, this card doesn't start gaining value until you're below 13 health. And in Hearthstone, you don't really ever feel too comfortable when you're at below 13 health. There's a lot of healing effects that are removed from the game. We're losing Healbot. Sludge Belcher is removed from the game, so we're losing some of the protective taunts. So it really makes this card like a little bit harder to work in, but at the same token, we're losing a lot of the burst and a lot of the aggression from the deck, from the decks in Hearthstone currently. So I'm not really too sure where to place this card yet. I think it's a card that could definitely have been a problem because just being able to do so many things in one turn is kind of what makes cards busted. And with Molten Giant, you're able to get it to 0 too easily at 20 mana cost. And then you can do things like Molten Shadow Flame, which clears your entire opponent's entire board, and then like Leroy Powerbomb, kill them, or something weird. So it's like there's too many combo things that could happen with Molten Giant that kind of limited design space because they'd have to think about every card they implement into Hearthstone. Well, how does this interact with 0 mana Molten Giants being a thing? So I think the nerf is good. I think it helps allow for better design space, but at the same time, I think it really, really hurts Molten Giant in the current state of Hearthstone just because of the lack of heals, the lack of solid taunts. But if the metagame slows down enough, I'm sure it'll still see play. But I don't think it's going to see as much play as it did before. I don't think it's going to like make or break or change Handlock too much. I think if you're going to be playing Handlock and you want to be playing Mountain Giants, you'd probably also include the Molten Giants. But at the same time, I think it's going to make it less prevalent in things like Reno Lock and just random decks that kind of occasionally had Molten Giants in them. I think they'll probably lose the ability to just throw a Molten Giant in something. All right, next up we have Master of Disguise. This is a change that kind of like most people saw coming. It was just a card that limited design space a little bit. So originally it's a 4-mana 4/4 Battlecry. Give a minions stealth, just stealth, not till the end of turn, just stealth forever basically, which could potentially run into problems as they design new cards for Hearthstone. Different generator cards or whatever, if you give it stealth forever, it can cause some problems. It didn't see play while it was this busted state, so it's probably not going to see play, as now it's been changed to give a friendly minion stealth until the end of your next turn. But it's just a little cleanup thing to make sure that they didn't have to really worry about that when designing new cards in Hearthstone. So I think it's a good nerf. Alright, next up we have the Blade Flurry change, which is something that a lot of people have been kind of talking about. Some people think it's, they've killed Blade Flurry, they've ruined the game, Rogue's terrible now, but I'm not one of those people. I actually think it's a pretty good nerf. So we have Blade Flurry at the 2 mana cost pre-nerf, which is destroy your weapon and deal its damage to all enemies. Now, after the nerf, it's going to be 4 mana instead of 2 mana, so double the mana cost, and destroy your weapon and deal its damage to all enemy minions. So it doesn't deal damage to the opponent's hero anymore, just their minions, and it costs twice as much. So yeah, a lot of things going on here. First off, the most important thing is we're going to be opening up the design space, right? Now, Blizzard can print good weapon buffs. They can print good weapons. The biggest thing for me is there's going to be no more cards like Poison Blade. Like, they'll actually print a card you can play instead of having to have the cool idea for this rogue weapon that grows, and then when it goes down to the balance testing people, they're like, nah, this needs to be Poison Blade, and yeah, that's not going to happen anymore, hopefully. Like, there's no guarantees on that, right? They still might print terrible weapons, but likely the design space is more open for Rogue to have cool new weapons and different weapon buffs, and things can actually happen with that, which I really like the idea of, because to me, that's what makes Rogue different than the other classes. That's what makes it unique and what really cool. Blade Flurry is probably my favorite card in all of Rogue, and setting up big Blade Flurries is like the play style of Rogue that I like the most. So I'm happy to see the potential for that to be worked out with more. So it might be a little bit of an overkill on the nerf, though. They do double the mana cost and remove its ability to hit face. Maybe doing one or the other might have been a little bit better. I still think, regardless, though, the card kind of has to see play. Not saying that it's good, not saying that it's bad, but I mean, it has to see play in Rogue, basically, because there's not too many great alternatives. It's really the only AoE in Rogue, and general play style of Rogue. You're not playing minions on curve every turn. You have a deck full of removal and cycle effects, and then you set up for a big tempo swing after you fall behind by using your cycle effects. So if that's still going to be the playstyle of Rogue, they'll have to use Blade Flurry because that's their only comeback mechanic in the deck. So I expect it to be a one-of in pretty much every Rogue deck. I don't think Dark Iron Skulker does enough as an AoE card to be the comeback mechanism for Rogue. So I imagine out of necessity it'll see play. I don't think the card is incredibly strong, but I think it has a lot of potential to still be as strong as it was, or even stronger. It depends what new cards come out, right? But I definitely think, regardless of new cards coming out that affect weapons, it's still going to be C-play as a one-of. Alright, next up we have Ancient of Lore. So this is a 7-mana 5/5 that draws 2 cards, gives your opponent combo, and then kills you. But now it's going to be a 7 mana 5/5 that draws one card or restores 5 health. So they've cut the card drawing mechanic down to only drawing one card instead of being able to draw two cards. So the first point with this is rarely do people ever use lore for healing for 5. So even though that effect isn't really touched, I mean, it's still a huge dramatic change in the card because the most important part about the Ancient of Lore was its ability to draw for 2. A 5/5 that draws one card for 7 mana, in my opinion, is pretty weak. You can compare it to things like Grand Crusader, which is a 6 mana 5/5 that draws a Paladin card. Granted, a Paladin card is on average a little bit worse than a card that you explicitly chosen to put in your deck, but still, for the mana cost and the difference there, Druid is a tempo deck. They heavily rely on using all of their mana as efficiently as possible, so I'm not so sure that lore is going to be that impactful of a card. I still think it will just see some play just because card draw is such a powerful mechanic in Hearthstone, and there's not too many great alternatives. Like, you have Azure Drakes and Ancient of Lore. Like, the other card draw mechanic cards, none of them allow you to keep up with tempo very great while drawing from your own deck, right? So you can play Cult Master, but that's a loss in tempo. Acolyte of Pain's a loss in tempo. Loot Hoarder is, technically speaking, probably about even on tempo for its stats. But like most of the other card draw mechanic cards have a huge decrease in stats for their cards. Ancient Lore does have a huge decrease in stats for its cards, but it's still like a body that can contest a lot of things that people are likely to play. However, if the meta slows down a ton and people are playing all these giant old gods and a 5/5 starts becoming not good enough to be able to trade with things, then we're going to see some problems with Ancient Lore, and it's going to fall into that category of like that Gnomish Inventor status where it's like, yeah, the stats are okay for the card draw effect, but at the same time, the body doesn't trade with anything. Whereas currently in the meta, the 5/5 trades with pretty much anything it wants to trade with pretty efficiently. So we'll see how that goes, what happens with the meta. If a 5/5 stat line is still good, I imagine a 5/5 stat line is still going to be pretty good, so I think this card will still see play. But anything can happen, right? There could be a meta where like everything has like 7 base health, so then the 5 attack isn't good enough anymore, or whatnot. Like, we'll have to see what happens with the 7-drop slots in the old gods. Alright, next up we have the Force of Nature change. So the nerf to the combo. We have Force of Nature being everybody's favorite card, which creates 3 treants, which then get roared and kill you. Now, Force of Nature is a 5 mana card instead of a 6 mana card, so a little bit of buff there for the mana cost. And then it summons 3 2/2 treants without charge. It just summons 3 2/2 treants, and they kind of chill there. They don't die at the end of the turn. You can use them for token druid potential, buff them up, do things with Power of the Wild, all that sort of good stuff to try and make some crazy token druid boards. And with that in mind, Roar is still going to be a really powerful card, because Roar was not one of the cards they nerfed. They just nerfed this part of the combo. So now Roar, still being the super inexpensive Bloodlust, is going to be able to interact with these token druid decks and blow people up if their board is left to live for any amount of time. So I think this card will see play. I think Roar is too strong of a card not to play, so I think you're going to want to be making a deck that revolves around Roar being good. So I think Token Druid is going to be a thing. I think Token Druid's going to play Force of Nature still, and Savage Roar, you could probably take an old Token Druid list that just has Violet Teacher's Power of the Wilds in it already, and the Force of Natures and the Savage Roars, throw that all together after the nerf and still play it just like you would play a normal druid. You're just building up a board now, and your opponent has the chance to react to the combo instead of the combo being not interactive at all and them just doing the damage from hand. Now they have a chance to try and AoE down your board before you roar and kill them. So it does give them a little bit of a chance to try and find that out there, but AoE is really, really uncommon in Hearthstone, so I think it's still going to be extremely powerful, and the flexibility of Roar, being able to just pair Roar while also silencing your opponent's taunt and things like that, is just incredibly powerful. So I imagine Token Druid's going to be really strong. I think they're going to play Force of Nature, and I think they're going to play Savage Roar, and the days of like getting force roared are not over yet. I think people are still going to be force roaring us. It's just going to be a little bit slower. Next up, we have Keeper of the Grove. So this card was a 4-mana 2/4 with choose one, deal 2 damage to a minion, or silence a minion. Now it's a 4-mana 2/2 with the same effect. So how important are the stats really? I mean, you really only play Keeper of the Grove for the deal 2 damage and the silence. Those are the most important parts. But in the same like vein, 2/2s really suck. So if you're playing this as your tech against anti-aggro, you innervate out Keeper of the Grove. Normally it would kill the minion you targeted at, and then it would be able to trade into the next minion and stay alive. Now you kill the minion you're targeting at, and then you trade into the next minion. So you're trading your Innervate and your Keeper of the Grove to kill 2 of your opponent's minions. So now it's a 2-for-2 trade instead of a 2-for-3 trade. So it's not as good as it was before, but it's still pretty effective against a lot of aggro decks just because you're slowing them down so much. But at the same time, I think Spellbreaker might start seeing play over this, or Mire Keeper might seeing play over Keeper of the Grove, just because they're both extremely powerful cards, and they kind of do the role of Keeper of the Grove nicely, especially Mire the Keeper just being such a powerful turn 4 play that Druid now has access to. And the stats of Keeper of the Grove being a 2-2 just make it way, way worse in mid-range decks, because mid-range decks require a lot of tempo, they require a lot of on-board control, and you can't afford to have such a weak stat card in your hand that's situational. Whereas control decks, they can afford to have a 2-2 that's a silence or a deal to it. They can afford to play nothing on some turns, then have comeback mechanics. So I think it's going to be pretty much not affect any sort of crazy control Druid builds, but I think it's really going to slow down mid-range Druid and make it a lot harder for them to fit in these sort of tech choices, and they'll have to have more of a linear game plan instead of being able to answer anything their opponent throws at them. Alright, next up we have Ironbeak Owl. This is a 2-mana 2-1 Battlecry Silence a minion, and now it's going to be a 3-mana 2-1 Battlecry Silence a minion. So first off, this change allows for potentially more design space because Blizzard doesn't have to worry about silence effects being as inexpensive when creating cards, except for when they create Priest cards, because Priest has the 0-mana silence. But just the tempo swing of being able to silence something, you have to worry about what else can they do while silencing things. And now it's a lot less because they have 1 less mana to work with. But this isn't all completely a downside for Ironbeak Owl. There's also an upside for Jeweled Scarab with this. Now, aggro decks or mid-range decks or whatever can run Jeweled Scarab and have the potential to find a silence off of their Jeweled Scarab because it finds a random 3-costing card. Now it can find Ironbeak Owl. So that's actually kind of cool. It makes that card a little bit better potentially. And overall though, Ironbeak Owl with his stat cost being a 3-mana 2-1, I think Spellbreaker will likely start seeing a lot more play as the silence card of choice, just because the stat line is so much better. A 4-mana 4-3 or a 3-mana 2-1. Granted, most of the time when you play a silence card, you really only care about the silence effect. But at the same time, you kind of care a little bit about the body if you're playing an aggressive or a mid-range deck, because aggressive and mid-range decks rely heavily on tempo, so they need to have a decent stat line associated with their tech cards for them to be able to justify playing them in case they get in a sticky situation where they gotta just throw it out there or what have you. Whereas control decks, they don't care about the stat line of the creatures, they more or less just care about the effect because they don't care about onboard tempo. They have their control-y game plans which result in either a finisher combo or fatigue, so they play for those outs and don't really care about onboard tempo. So control decks could still justifiably just play Ironbeak Owl as a 3-mana 2-1 without too much damage to their deck, I assume. Next up we have Big Game Hunter, which is... It used to be 3-mana 4-2, kill your opponent's Dr. Boom. Now it is a 5-mana 4-2, kill your opponent's not Dr. Boom, because that's not in standard anymore, but Old God. So it's still a really strong tech card. You can't anymore play BGH and then also play a huge minion. You have to play BGH and then play a 5-drop instead of being able to like BGH play your Dr. Boom, for example, which has been happening a lot in Hearthstone. So you can't have those crazy tempo swings that are just unrecoverable from your opponent and then you win the game off of them. So I like that change a lot. I think aggro and mid-range decks will have a lot harder time using this card now because you can't tempo BGH anymore, which is a really common play that Druid just did with their BGH in their mid-range Druid decks. So the higher stated costing the tech card is and the harder the tech card is on your tempo, then the less likely it is to be able to be fit into aggro and mid-range decks. There's even periods right now in the meta where people are playing Big Game Hunter in their Zoo deck, which Zoo is a very aggressive deck. Some people say it's kind of like not an aggro deck, but Zoo is very aggressive with a low curve and can still fit the tech card of BGH in. So I think it's a very much needed change to increase the cost of BGH. I think the change is really fair. The card's still going to see play. I think control decks will still definitely use BGH in all of your control decks without having too much worry about the mana cost, because in your control deck you didn't really care about the mana cost anyway, but it's going to be a lot harder for people to fit it in their aggro decks. It's going to be a lot harder for people to fit it in their Druid, their mid-range decks. So I really like the change of BGH. I think it is very, very well done, and it sort of makes tech cards more like what they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be cards that are in control decks, not really supposed to just be in every deck. They're supposed to be in specific decks for specific purposes. So I like the change on BGH here. Next up we have Hunter's Mark. Hunter's Mark was a 0 mana card to change a minion's health to 1. Now it's a 1 mana card, change a minion's health to 1. This sort of affects the same thing with all the other tech cards that I keep talking about. It just keeps coming back to this, is that it affects the early game tempo of aggro decks, and if aggro decks can even really run the card. Hearthstone Face Hunter used to run Hunter's Marks occasionally so that they could play like their 1-drop, they could play their 2-drop, which was usually like Haunted Creeper, and then they can just Hunter's Mark something and play Animal Companion and trade in their minion without having to worry about using removal on the earlier stages. They could just develop a minion while trading and pull ahead early on and then push for more face damage. Well, that's a lot harder to do when the card actually has a mana cost attached to it. Now it's like using removal. You can't just flatly keep developing while using the card. So it affects the early game tempo for aggro decks and affects that purpose of using Hunter's Mark, but doesn't really at all affect the control purpose of using Hunter's Mark, which was to use it sort of like as an execute with things like Unleash the Hounds and other combos to be able to control the board. So it's not going to damage anyone's fatigue hunters at all, or their crazy long-term hunters, but it's definitely going to be a little impactful for aggro and mid-range hunters. So again, it's just a change that makes a tech card more like what a tech card I feel like should be. It makes it good in control decks and a lot riskier to play it in aggro and mid-range decks. And I really like these changes that Blizzard's been implementing, sort of leaning more towards a controlling meta, with the old gods coming out being all these big, bulky old gods. It makes sense to change these sort of tech cards, make sure that they're adjusted and much better in control than rather than just being good in everything. So I like that side of things. I think a lot of the nerfs were really well done. The only nerf I don't really like is the nerf to Arcane Golem. I think that was a little brutal. That card is trash now. So if you have a lot of Arcane Golems, you're gonna get a lot of dust. But other than that, I think all the other changes I'm pretty happy with. Blade Flurry might have been a bit excessive. I still think the card's gonna be playable, but yeah, that's anyway my opinion on the nerfs. If you have any questions or you want some comments on thoughts of the nerfs on your own, feel free to post them in the comments. Anyway, guys, I really appreciate you watching my video. Feel free to subscribe to this YouTube channel if you want to see more content about other nerfs as they come up, or Old Gods cards, or just Hearthstone stuff in general. Anyway, take care, guys. Bat out. I got a lot of secrets here. 3, 6, 7, 8. So if I draw this, I go up to 9 cards in my hand.